Hey there! You know those moments of truth? Those moments where truth just hits you at the core of your being? You know those instances where you hear or you read something, or you hear someone say something, and it just cuts to the center of you? And you feel that shift inside? Well, I had one of those moments this week. And I wanted to share it with you tonight because it created such a shift for me inside, a life shift. And it brought to life such wisdom and insight for me that I'm hoping that by sharing it with you, it will create the same spark, the same shift in you, or that's similar that it did in me. It's not necessarily new information. It's stuff that I teach all the time and coach my clients on all the time, and we read about, and we'll all know and have heard it several times. But on Monday, it hit me so hard and it stared me in the face in such a deep way that it cut to the core in such a new and personal way for me that I wanted to share it because it was life-shifting. And here's what happened. As a coach, as a counselor, as a speaker, as a writer, I share parts of my story with my clients, with the audiences, with the people that I influence. I share those parts of my story a lot. And as an intuitive and as an empath, one of my strengths and one of my gifts is the ability to connect and to share in a real and personal and vulnerable way with people. And as human beings, we're hardwired for connection. And I, in particular, being the therapist and the coach and the empath and the intuitive, really value and need deep, meaningful connection in my life and in my relationships. I also understand how crucial it is that to have connection and vulnerability in order to have intimacy and experience healing. So as I said, sharing parts of my story for years with my clients and my audiences is nothing new. But recently, due to professional growth and personal growth and development, I decided to work with a coach of my own, a different coach of my own, who specializes in storytelling and persuasive narrative. And so as a result of me stepping out into larger venues as a coach and a speaker, I figured that this was a way to if I could have someone help me increase my impact and expand the impact that I have on the lives and the hearts of those that I speak to, those that I coach, and those people that I influence. So Monday was my first session, and with my new coach, my new storytelling coach, and my session was on Skype. He's in Colorado, and so this was the first time I'd ever met him face to face, through Skype, virtually, I guess you would say. And it's the first time he'd met me, the first time he'd seen me, the first time I'd seen him. And let me just tell you about him. He's got a British accent. He's an award-winning publisher. He's a professional actor, a storyteller, and he works with all the big name speakers and authors. And he's done that for years. And here's me, Georgia girl, with a southern accent, unrefined, unpolished, and all of my inadequacy came to the surface. All of my feelings of unworthiness, all of that feeling of being exposed and vulnerable, I felt like a mess. But, like I've known to do for years and years, I quickly put on a confident face, pulled out the best version of myself, got my act together, and I moved into my achiever performer mode, which I know so well. And I was able to settle into the session and engage. And a few minutes into it, I was realizing, wow, this works. And I can do this, and I'm smart, and I'm capable, and wow, I connect with him, and I'm successful, and I'm sought after, and I can get this. That is until he asked me to do a really tough exercise for me. He said to me, you have 90 seconds to write down the 3 most memorable, impactful moments in your life. And then when you get done, I'm going to have you tell me the story about them. Well, multiple memories just flooded my mind, and I found myself feeling really overwhelmed and anxious. And then it turned into panic. And of course I held it together. He couldn't see that, I hope. But all of these questions began to flood my mind, that what if I miss the most impactful moments and I choose the wrong ones? What if he thinks my moments are dumb? What if he's going to ask me to include these moments into my story that I write and they don't represent my story well? Or what if my story just isn't that interesting? What if I don't do it right? So I sat for a few seconds and I just allowed it to run over in my head, and I tried to pull myself together and think rationally. So then I voiced a couple of my questions, my concerns to him, my more rational concerns and questions to him. And he saw my anxiety, and he said very compassionately and very simply, he said, "Don't judge, don't overthink, don't worry. It's not wrong. They're your memories. It's your story, and it's valuable and it's important." Then he went on to remind me of one of the most famous quotes from President Theodore Roosevelt, and it's "The Man in the Arena." And I've read this poem, or this speech, so many times, and love Brene Brown's work, and she includes this in her work and writes her work around this, or centers her work around this poem, or her one book, Daring Greatly, around this poem in particular. And the coach said to me, "Connie, it just really comes down to you being willing to let yourself be seen." Wow. That truth just dropped right to the center of me in a powerful way. And I said, yeah, that's it. And I realized that the core of my shame and the core of my fear was being triggered in this moment. And that if I let myself be seen, really seen, I feared that it was going to be not enough or too much. And then, what if I'm not enough? Or what if I'm too much? Do you relate? My mind was just flooded about all the times that my fear of being exposed, that my shame being exposed kept me from being seen and kept me from being known in relationships, in my work, in moments, experiences. And I felt sadness and I felt grief over that. And I see that every day in my clients. The fear of hurt and rejection, the fear of shame of not being enough or being too much, keeps men and women from showing up in their fullness. And as Brene Brown calls it, showing up wholeheartedly, living wholeheartedly. And in her book, Daring Greatly, she speaks profoundly about the struggle with vulnerability and with showing up. She says, in a world where not being enough or too much dominates us, and fear of being vulnerable and exposed is second nature, it just feels too scary, too uncomfortable, and too dangerous for us. The risk of getting criticized, hurt, rejected is too great for us. But at the heart of us, there is nothing more painful than standing on the outside of the arena, looking in. Whether it's a new relationship, whether it's an important meeting, whether it's our creative process, or a difficult conversation with a family member or a friend or a spouse. I want to ask you, will you dare show up? And if you do, how do you show up? How do you show up in your relationships? How do you show up in your marriage? How do you show up in your work meetings, in your work relationships? How do you show up in your creative process? Will you risk being vulnerable? Are you willing to let yourself be seen? After the coaching session on Monday, I went back and I reread the famous speech from President Roosevelt. And he says this: "It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who at his best knows, or at the best, knows in the end that the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly." So I now know in a very real and personal way that to have the life that I desire, to have the relationships with the connection and the intimacy that I desire, to have that kind of impact that I want to have with using my gifts and my abilities in the path that God has for me, that I must dare to show up. I must let myself be seen. And that I can't wait until I'm perfect or until I'm bulletproof, even though that, as Brene Brown says, sounds really seductive, but it's not humanly possible. And I say to you that we must walk into the arena with courage, with willingness to engage wholeheartedly. We must dare to show up and let ourselves be seen. Will you?